Good evening. Welcome to the Maison Française. I must say that it is an honor, also a great pleasure, to introduce Éric Fassin tonight. I think I'm not going into like the personal story of when we met and stuff, so let's skip that. But it's still a great honor to introduce him to here at the Maison Française. Éric Fassin, as many of you know, is a professor of sociology and gender studies at the University of Paris 8, Vincennes-Saint-Denis, and is also affiliated with the Sophia Paul Research Center, and is currently also a senior member of the Institut Universitaire de France. Éric has been a central figure in transatlantic dialogues, especially between France and the US, on questions of race, gender, sexuality, post-colonial studies, immigration, and academic freedom. His work has shown us both the deep connections between all these issues and their centrality in contemporary democratic and undemocratic debates across the world. He has written many books, and he has something very special is happening with Éric, that the older he gets, the more books he produces every year. So I'm just going to quote the 4 books that were published in the past 2 years, some of them being translation from others. So it's a little more. There is a little more explanation to this incredible productivity. Very recently published in French in 2025, La savante et le politique, ce que le féminisme fait aux sciences sociales, in collaboration with Caroline Ibos. Les études de genre, also in 2025, Misère de l'anti-intellectualisme in 2024, and State Anti-Intellectualism and the Politics of Gender and Race, Illiberal France and Beyond, that was published in 2024, and which I think is the book from which the talk tonight is drawn. But Éric's impact is not limited to the classroom or to the written page. By all accounts, he's a sociologue engagé whose academic work is shaped by his public interventions and vice versa. He has participated in all the most pivotal debates in France in the past 30 years, from same-sex marriage to the pushback against gender ideology, from the deconstruction of the politics of colorblindness to the denunciation of racialized police violence, from the denunciation of the concept of Islamo-gauchism, which in France has been promoted and spread by the French state, and especially the French administration in charge of higher education and research, to the defense of academic freedom. To all these discussions, debates and polemics, and sometimes very violent polemics in France, Éric has brought intellectual rigor, rhetorical elegance, and an unwavering courage, a determination that is an inspiration for many of us in academia at a time when intellectual autonomy is so deeply challenged. We are thus very grateful, at least I am grateful, and I know a lot of people who are grateful for his work, and a work from which we're getting a sample tonight with his lecture, State Anti-Intellectualism and the Campaigns Against Critical Thinking, Minorities and the Left, France, the US, and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Éric Fassin.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here for many reasons. The first one being that to get such an introduction, I'd like to meet that person that you just talked about. Second, because there's nostalgia in coming back to New York, and in particular to Columbia. I've been repeatedly visiting friends and giving talks in New York for quite a while, quite a few decades now, and it's always a pleasure. But in particular, given the topic that I'm going to address tonight, I think it makes a lot of sense, and I hope it will for you as well. Clearly, talking about state anti-intellectualism is relevant both in the context of France and in the context of the US. I will be looking at my watch regularly, not because I'm bored with my presentation, but because I would like to, oh, it's there, that's perfect, thank you. That's better. So just to make sure that I leave enough time for the discussion. Since it's comparative work based on the French side and the American side, let me start with recent events on both sides. And in particular, since my work has been for a long time around the concept of actualité, that is what is unfolding now, that is the historicity of the present. It is important for me to start from there, and of course then to try and understand how it comes from somewhere. It didn't start right now, but still there's something happening. The first example that I want to use is that of what happened recently at Berkeley. As I'm sure all of you know, there was the revelation at the end of the summer that the university had agreed to pass on a list of names of students, faculty, staff to the Trump administration. And this was revealed at first by Judith Butler, who was one of the persons in that list. Now, what was interesting for my purposes, I mean, it's important, difficult, and interesting for many reasons, but one element that I want to emphasize is that the starting point was the question of anti-Semitism. But at the same time, the president was, and his administration were engaging in a discussion that had to do not just, in a negotiation rather, that had to do not just with the alleged accusations of anti-Semitism, but more generally things like what to do about trans students. And so, in fact, there's a continuity here that I will be returning to between different issues that ostensibly are unrelated. And the reason, one reason why I'm interested in this is because I've been working in gender studies, as you mentioned, for a long time. Now, let me take a second example now on the French side. If you think, and maybe you've heard of it, of the Collège de France, a very prestigious institution that was launched in the 16th century and that was always defined by its autonomy. There's a conference that was supposed to take place at the Collège de France about a week ago or something like that, and it was about Palestine, Israel, and Europe in a historical perspective. As you may have heard, it was canceled by the administrator of the Collège de France, following pressures from associations, NGOs, from groups of people, from some media, and eventually from the Minister of Higher Education. One of the paradoxes is that this attack against an academic event, well, I should add, actually, that not only was it canceled, but then there was a lawsuit, and the lawsuit was dismissed, basically saying it's not an attack on academic freedom. And one has to wonder, then what is an attack on academic freedom? But what is interesting is that these attacks on academic freedom were launched in the name of academic freedom. That is the argument that was used by the minister, who said, of course, because of academic freedom, I cannot tell you to cancel it, but because I believe in academic freedom, I have to tell you that what you're about to do is contrary to academic freedom. It's a complicated argument, and I just want to summarize it for those of you who may not have followed every detail of this beautiful story. Now, I think this is crucial for understanding what is going on, not just in France, but also in the US. The sort of Orwellian argument that has been used is essential to anti-intellectualism. That is, you can turn things around one way or the other, etc. In the end, no one knows exactly what anything means. So that's the reason why what I try to do is to maintain what is, I believe, a professional duty, which is to try and make sense of things in a rational way, to try to explain, to try to clarify, to try to have empirical information that you double check, to try to have theoretical arguments that are hopefully somewhat consistent, etc., etc. So basically, what I will be presenting is part of my attempt at continuing to defend academic freedom through academic work. That is, not just having opinions, but doing work, doing intellectual work, and trying to produce meaning based on research. And in fact, that's one reason why I decided many years ago, and in particular recently, that I was not going to talk about Israel and Palestine, because basically I have opinions, but I don't have an expertise on what's going on in the Middle East. And I would like to maintain the idea that I hope that the use that we can have is not just to have opinions, but to say that some kind of expertise, some kind of academic work is important, has value, especially in the context of anti-intellectualism. So in particular, what I will do now is what I have been doing for a long time. I first started writing on attacks against academia in 1992. So I claim that I've been doing that for a while and therefore can say something about it. So let me try to retrace this history based on not just what has happened forever, but things that I have worked on and that I believe are relevant. The first thing is that you may recall that in the early 1990s, in the US and immediately after in France, there was a whole polemic against so-called political correctness, with a variation on sexual correctness. But political correctness was immediately, at least the polemic against political correctness was immediately transferred to France. It was translated poorly very often. That is, basically, you had the phrase le politically correct, which was difficult to pronounce. And then, of course, it was adapted and it became le politiquement correct, which is not very good French, if I may. But that shows that the transatlantic circulation was already there, and very rapidly. Now, this attack on political correctness was also an attack against universities. And in particular, there was an article about academia being islands of repression in a sea of freedom. That was the post-1989 moment. And the phrase that was coined at the time was left-wing McCarthyism. And of course, the reason why I mention this is because we've heard again about left-wing McCarthyism. This is not something that has been invented for recent purposes. It was around in the early 1990s. And so in many ways, I think it is worth remembering that things didn't start with the recent accusations. Basically, and without drawing any conclusions about what happens in the Middle East, things, as far as academia are concerned, didn't start on October 7th. So the first round, I would say, was this attack against political correctness, and in particular with a very clever move on the part of neoconservatives that is making an alliance with liberals against campus radicals in the name of freedom of expression. And this, I think, is something that we know is still part of the discussion, or has been in the last few years. Now, that's the first round of the elements that I have been working on that I think is relevant. But let me now, because I'm still looking at the watch, let me now move to a second round much later. In the early 2010s, we started having in France, and I must say first in France with some pride, and later in other countries, attacks against the ideology of gender or gender ideology. Now, in France, this has been called la théorie du genre, gender theory. And the word, I think, is important if we want to think about anti-intellectualism. I realized recently that it's not just in France that it's called gender theory, it's also in Slovenia. And so, but I still claim that France had a leading role in that story, even though it had circulated for a long time, the attacks of the Vatican had been around, etc. But the idea that this religious Catholic, and not just Catholic, but mainly Catholic attack against gender was not just religious anymore, but became a political attack with a sort of coalition of all kinds of groups of people on the right who had no religious intentions or ideologies or anything. This, I think, was crucial. Because in fact, if you consider the attacks by the Vatican that started in the 1990s, in particular with the Beijing conference in 1995, and what has developed since, these attacks were not anti-intellectual. The Vatican is not anti-intellectual. Actually, if you think of Cardinal Ratzinger, who then became Pope Benedict, he claimed to be an intellectual. He would have a debate with Jürgen Habermas. What about faith and reason? Not an opposition between faith and reason. On the contrary. So it was not an anti-intellectual argument. The anti-intellectualism came in the years 2010 when it moved from being a Catholic issue or a religious issue more generally to being a right-wing issue. Of course, I realized that these two may overlap. But to focus on the fact that it was not primarily religious anymore. And this was illustrated by an image used by my colleague David Paternotte, who talks about Frankenstein. That is, basically you create a monster and then the monster has its own way. And this is what happened for the Catholic Church. That is, basically, it changed. It became something else. And what is the difference once you introduce the anti-intellectualism? Well, there is a second difference. Not just the anti-intellectualism that was, for example, illustrated by the fact that people who demonstrated in Paris against the recognition of same-sex marriage sometimes regrouped under the name sens commun, common sense, which is clearly meant to be the opposite of theory. And of course, the anti-intellectual arguments were used also against people like Judith Butler, whom I mentioned before, and with elements of anti-Semitism in the process. The idea that a Jewish lesbian was into theories and therefore very different from real people. This was part of the story. But there's another element, not just anti-intellectualism, there's race. Race enters the picture in the years 2010, which was not the case with the Catholic Church. A good point about the Catholic Church is that it's meant to be Catholic. And therefore, it's supposed to be not limited to Europe or not limited to a certain area in the world. It's supposed to be all over the place. And therefore, despite the fact that, of course, just like anywhere else, there's racism in the Catholic Church, etc., but it's not a principle that plays a major role as such. It's a practice just like in the rest of society, but it's not meant to be racist. So anti-intellectualism and attacks not just on gender, but on race, with the fact that, as you know, in the US, it's not just race, it's critical race theory. And you see the word again. In France, people don't use the term critical race theory. The attack has been on intersectionality, and since no one knew what the term meant, it had a theoretical flavor for the president and his ministers. So the this inclusion of race, in addition to anti-intellectualism in all these attacks against universities, means that we're talking not just about social movements. We're not just talking about women's liberation or about LGBT movements. We're not just talking about Me Too or Black Lives Matter, but we're also talking about academic discourse that is supposed to be part of the problem. That is, the idea is not just that there are women, gays, blacks, etc., mobilizing. No, no, it's at the same time the responsibility of academia. Now, this change, or at least partly the responsibility of academia, this change makes me differentiate between the original attack against gender studies and against the concept of gender by the Vatican and the movement in the 2010s that expanded to include race, etc. It's a shift from a reactionary position, that is a reaction against the evolution of things, to a neo-fascist movement. And I think that is essential if we want to understand what is happening in the world today, including in Chile in the elections over the weekend. So this neo-fascist logic, and I have been using this term for quite a while, despite some resistance. It's more difficult to publish an article in the French press if you talk about neo-fascism, so I don't recommend it. But I think it is important because it was initially euphemized. There was talk of populism. Populism was the key word if you wanted to talk about the far right, for example, which seemed to say that basically it has to do with people. Well, it doesn't have to do with people, it has to do with ideologies. And of course, ideologies can mobilize people, but it's a political fight and should be understood as such. It's not just a popular reaction, for example, as was argued by Chantal Mouffe in her defense of left-wing populism. It's not people who are not happy with neoliberalism, etc. No, no, it's quite a different thing. Neo-fascism can work quite well with neoliberalism, as I'm sure you know. Authoritarian neoliberalism can quite easily mix with a sort of neo-fascist neoliberalism. But so it became an attack on academia and not just on the social movements. It's interesting, in the US, of course, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, before he became Vice President, obviously, in 2021, gave a speech that was called, "The Universities Are the Enemy." We could think it's a peculiar American element. Well, not quite, because in fact, in 2020, the French President, Emmanuel Macron, had a quote in Le Monde in an article in which the discussion had to do with is the government, are the political parties in power losing youths? And he said, les universitaires ont été coupables. Academics have been guilty. So it's not so different saying the accusation, the guilt of academics who are partly, according to the president, responsible for the, I quote, ethnicization of the social question, which reminds some of us of works that we have accomplished over the years. So this accusation that academics break the republic in two is very similar to what has been heard in the US. So I want to emphasize the fact that we shouldn't insist too much on something like American exceptionalism about what is going on today. Not that there's nothing singular about what is going on in the US, of course there is. But I think it's part of a general trend, and looking at France, which is often defined as a more liberal state these days, I think it's useful to avoid that illusion. Now, if we consider all this context, what we have to think is that things didn't start on October 7th. For example, in France, in 2024, when there was a polemic about accusations of potentially anti-Semitism, maybe one remark was made that was anti-Semitic, or maybe it was just anti-Zionist or something, at Sciences Po in Paris in March 2024. And when I say maybe, it's because the charges of anti-Semitism have been dropped after the investigation. Now, what was remarkable is that the political mobilization on this was quite similar to things that you have all seen in the US. In particular, on the same day, after 2 or 3 hours after the tweet that revealed this accusation, you had the Minister of Higher Education visiting Sciences Po and talking to everyone. And the next morning, you had the French president in the Conseil des Ministres denouncing all this as unbearable, etc. And in the afternoon, that is 24 hours after the alleged incident, which is one sentence that may have been uttered by someone, we don't know whom, and it's not clear who heard it, after the investigation. The Prime Minister, along with the Minister of Higher Education, barged in the meeting of the governing board of Sciences Po and started using a phrase which is my favorite, le poisson pourri par la tête, and the idea that, which shows a sort of unexpected left-wing culture on the part of the Prime Minister, but also more interestingly, the fact that clearly he was not thinking that the head in France is people in power. The head is academia, which means that power has no head, because otherwise you couldn't say that the fish is rotten starting with a head. If you're the Prime Minister, you would think that's dangerous ground. I mean, some of us might agree under those circumstances, but that was not, I think, his intention. You see, competence matters. I know the Prime Minister didn't mean that. This element, I think, is important because the very same day, you had people on the far right complaining about this, like Éric Zemmour saying Sciences Po was not what he'd known. But also you had the head of the Senate, the president of the Senate, Gérard Larcher, who described Sciences Po as an Islamo-leftist bunker. Now, the part that interests me is Islamo-leftist in there. That is basically, he's showing the continuity between the attacks that had preceded, that were against cancel culture, that were against wokeness, that were, in the French formulation, against Islamo-gauchisme. So the continuity was there, the effort at saying we're just against all these people. And there's a change, of course, because before that it was mostly against places like the one where I teach, Paris 8. So the suburbs with many working class students and many racialized students. And now it was in the center of Paris, the elites. And of course, that's an introduction to what's happened with the Collège de France. That is basically what started in the margins is now in the center. What started against people who were considered to be radicals against people like Henri Laurence, who's the man who's organizing the Collège de France conference, who are moderate, who are not particularly radical. So it's a generalization from margin to center of these attacks. Now, what I want to do now is to explain a bit more what I mean by anti-intellectualism, and I will try to conclude later with some reflections on academic freedom. I have talked about anti-intellectualism without defining the term, and that's what I would like to do now, because it seems to me that there's a risk of being misunderstood when one talks about anti-intellectualism. And the first, and this may seem paradoxical for someone who's supposed to be a sociologist, but the first point that I want to make is that it's not a sociological category. That is, it is not an opposition between intellectuals and non-intellectuals. It is not an opposition between educated and uneducated. So it's not a sociological categorization. It's an ideological one. Let me explain what I mean by that. If it were a sociological categorization, then it would mean that intellectuals would all be on one side and non-intellectuals on the other side. But of course, as we know, there's a whole business for intellectuals, in particular retired intellectuals, academics, to produce anti-intellectual discourse. Which means it's not a division between intellectuals and non-intellectuals, it's a division among intellectuals. And in particular, I must say, and this will be my polemical moment, that it seems that sometimes it gives a sort of second life to people whose presence had been maybe forgotten. And who all of a sudden gain considerable visibility just by denouncing their colleagues, and in particular, their younger colleagues. And it is true that as I age, I understand that the problem is young people, but I think at the same time, it reveals something about the structure of power in the university and how it is changing and how new generations are changing the terms of discussion. Now, this element of anti-intellectualism, it's not just that it's not intellectuals versus non-intellectuals, but the opposition is also about educated versus uneducated. Now, why do I mention that? Because in particular in the US, even more so than in France, there has been considerable insistence on the fact that educated people, that is, with a university degree, vote for the Democrats, for Kamala Harris, for example, and that people without a degree tend to vote for Republicans, say, for Donald Trump. Now, that's not quite true. There are two reasons, at least, to qualify such a statement, which is based on exit polls. But there are at least two reasons. The first one is most people with less education don't vote. So in fact, for example, when you hear in France that the working class, les ouvriers, the National Rally is the first party for ouvriers, for workers. The first party for workers in France is not voting. And that is quite important because in fact it means that there's a difference in terms of class. Not everyone votes the same. And the second reason that I find particularly striking, which we cannot measure in France, but which you can in the US, is that if you look educated, uneducated, look at the exit polls, and you realize that there's no difference between educated and uneducated for Black people. So in fact, what it means, it's white educated versus white uneducated, which means the element of race is important. So it's not just education, it's education mixed with race. I think that's an important element because the idea that it's educated versus uneducated has been at the center of conservative or reactionary politics for decades, with the idea that you have, on the one hand, elites, intellectual elites, cultural elites, bobos. On the other hand, you have real people, les vrais gens, in French. And les vrais gens, we are told, they're on the side of reality, and they're not really into all this theoretical thing. Gender theory. I mean, that's just for sophisticated people, because basically real people don't have a gender. And critical race theory? No, it's only sophisticated people who think about race, right? I mean, in society, race doesn't matter, as we all know. I think there's a punctuation mark that does not exist orally. That's the point of irony. But what is interesting is that this rhetoric has been very efficient, and it has been crucial for the right in many countries, in particular France and the US, which I know better. Why? Because basically it says that elites are cultural elites, which is wonderful because it means it's not economic elites. The real class issue, we are told by conservatives, is not money, it's not capital, it's not an economic hierarchy. It is just, quite simply, some people will have quotes in Latin. Some people will watch Scandinavian films with subtitles. And they eat tofu. Some of them ride bicycles. They drink latte, you know, the phrase latte liberals. So all these, it used to be the French that were brie eating, monkeys, if I remember correctly. But the idea that it's cultural practices that define social hierarchy. I tend to view that as a sort of Bourdieu gone mad theory. That is, as you know, Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist, said it's not just economic capital. There's also something called cultural capital. But the right-wing version is there's no such thing as economic capital because Elon Musk is a regular guy. And Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, actually he does MMA. So in fact, all these people are guys. Not just real guys, but guys, which I think is very essential to understand what is going on today. Intellectual is not very manly, as we know. I mean, there's a long history of that, which is in part a history of anti-Semitism as well. By contrast, not being an intellectual means you're a regular guy. And if you're a regular guy, and I insist and maybe too much on guy, but the regular guy is someone who's not elitist despite his billions. So this shift from one version of class struggle based on economic class to another that is based purely on cultural class, I think is central for understanding how anti-intellectualism works. Now, if we take that seriously, we realize that anti-intellectualism is not a sociological phenomenon. It is an ideological phenomenon that tries to be perceived as a sociological one. The real people versus abstract elites that are interested in weird things. 5-syllable words, etc. Now, since I can go on for about 5? Good. So time to move to academic freedom, per se. There's an interesting history of the relationship between freedom of expression and academic freedom. Why was Berkeley attacked recently? It seems to me that it's no accident that Berkeley was identified with free speech. That is, with the idea that politics also belongs in the university. And that is an interesting twist, because in fact, for years in the US and in France, conservatives, and when I say conservatives, it's my polite way of saying neo-fascists, but conservatives have been insisting on the fact that they were on the side of free speech, in particular against cancel culture, against left-wing McCarthyism, etc. And this is not just in the US. I mean, in France as well, the phrase "on ne peut plus rien dire" became a sort of running joke. That is the idea that basically people, there was, in Le Monde, there was a suggestion at one point, which I thought was very interesting, about braillonnés, that is people who were both gagged, but also who kept making noise. That is, people who keep saying everywhere that they're not allowed to say anything anywhere. And this has become a systematic element in politics. So basically, it was free speech against academia, which was supposed to be intolerant, because basically academia, and the argument was the same both in France and the US, academia was supposed to attack hate speech, that is racist, sexist, transphobic, etc. speech. And this idea was that academic freedom, in fact, was against free speech. Now, things have changed. And in particular, the idea on ne peut plus rien dire has been replaced, in particular since October 7th, by taisez-vous. Shut up. That's what we've heard in France, and I think that's what people have heard in the US as well. We don't want to hear what you have to say. I need not illustrate all the forms of censorship that have been developing in the last few years on both sides. I started with two examples, Berkeley and the Collège de France, but these are just examples. But you see the same thing in the media, having access to the media, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that is interesting because the idea of left-wing McCarthyism has given way to something new. You may have seen that in Florida, they're trying to rehabilitate McCarthyism. I read that a couple of days ago in the Los Angeles Times. That is basically, it was not such a bad thing, McCarthyism, which is kind of a surprising twist if you consider that not so long ago, left-wing McCarthyism was an insult, but now McCarthyism should not be an insult. So it's only left-wing McCarthyism that should be an insult. And the same happens with the notion of hate speech. There's a rehabilitation on the part of Pam Bondi and on the part of President Trump of hate speech, because hate speech is only a problem when it comes from the left, inciting violence, etc. So it's a constant reversal of words, which is part precisely of this neo-fascist moment. It's a rhetoric that is pure Orwell, that is turning the meaning of things upside down constantly. So in the end, no one knows exactly what words mean. That's why it's important to define academic freedom, and with a difference between academic freedom and free expression. And this is something that I have tried to develop recently, following work that has been conducted in the US by people like Joan Scott, like Robert Post, and others. The distinction between free expression, free speech, and academic freedom, I would summarize in my own terms as, on the one hand, freedom of expression is the right to say anything, because it's opinions. So it's not truth, which means you can say things that have nothing to do with truth. That's freedom of expression. It's values, opinions, not truths, not facts, not theories, not whatever. On the contrary, the academic freedom is based on the idea that, yes, you can say everything, but not anything. And here I use a concept that was developed by Princeton philosopher Harry Frankfurt, bullshit. He wrote a text in the early 2000s that's called On Bullshit. And it's very useful for thinking about what's going on now, including because it gives me a sort of legitimate reference for using this word in such an environment. Bullshit, he says, is very different from lying. Lying means you're trying to make people believe that what you're saying is true, which means you're still paying respect to an idea of truth. Bullshit? No. You're not trying to make people believe it's true. You're just trying to say something that is pleasing, that is entertaining. You're just basically having a good time, and people listening to you are having a good time. A pure example of the political uses of bullshit, I think, was during the American campaign, the Haitians eating dogs and cats, or cats and dogs. What is interesting about this is that it was not meant to be real. It doesn't matter. It's just fun, because basically you can enjoy despising people. And that's pleasurable. That, I think, is fundamental for understanding what is going on now. Because in fact, what we see journalists doing very often in France, in the US, elsewhere, is fact-checking. Fact-checking is a good thing when you're dealing with liars. But if you're dealing with bullshit, you remember Kellyanne Conway, who used the term alternative facts after the first inauguration of President Trump in 2017. Alternative facts, you're not going to start verifying or falsifying alternative facts. It's beyond all this. It's just meant to be fun. It's just meant to be a true jouissance. That, I think, has been fundamental for neo-fascists. The jouissance of saying n'importe quoi, of bullshit. And of course, people like us are offended, and we say, you cannot say this because it's not true, etc. And that doubles the pleasure. Because anti-intellectualism means it's great to offend people who will insist on checking facts, etc. So I think we have to take this seriously if we're thinking about academic freedom. Academic freedom is based on the idea that you're not supposed to utter bullshit. Now, some of you may have heard a few colleagues who sometimes have not exactly avoided bullshit. That happens, but in principle, that's not a good thing, because basically the more bullshit you say as an academic, the more your credit among other academics goes down. We all depend on the fact that our peers think that what we do has some value. And so I think that's an important distinction. Basically, we have a sort of professional obligation to try and avoid bullshit, which means at the moment, I think it's no accident that academia is under attack. It's precisely because it's one of the regimes of truth alongside the judicial, alongside the media, alongside the publishing industry, etc. But it's one of them. And the difference with these other regimes of truth is the regime of truth embodied by academia has to do also with students. That is the contact between students and professors. That is the contact between academic freedom, that of professors, and freedom of expression of students. And it's the confrontation of the two. That is opinions and some kind of knowledge or expertise or whatever. That's what universities do. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions. There are mics circulating. A question here.
Thank you. I was intrigued by the distinction between bullshit.
Your mic is not working, or
Yeah, just put it closer.
Oh, closer. Okay. I was intrigued with the distinction between bullshit and truth. But in Harry Frankfurt's article, there's another concept that is lurking, which is the idea of a bull session, where it's not strictly about the truth, but rather a sort of a discussion that you have, perhaps with the aspiration to sort of get to a truth. But I would have thought that bull session was the more appropriate concept for academic freedom or even freedom of expression. So I was wondering what your, as opposed to simply saying, there's truth and then there's bullshit, but there's something called a bull session that is somewhat different.
I didn't say that academia is about truth. It's about the pursuit of truth. And it's a regime of truth. because basically, if I said that it's pure truth or absolute truth or whatever, I would be in trouble as someone who's spent a lot of time using Foucault and all that, so I'd be in deep trouble. But I think it's more the idea that it's a regime of truth, that is basically that is subjected to certain rules, etc., which has downsides, as we all know. That is, if you work in gender studies, for example, you know that quite a few colleagues will say, oh, that's bullshit, or if you do other minority stuff or whatever. So the question of disciplines can be a problem, but at the same time, the idea that basically, if you do gender studies, what do you try to do? You try to show that it's work that is not just bullshit. And so the idea that it's pas n'importe quoi, that is that you have certain efforts at having something rigorous, if possible. So I use the reference to Harry Frankfurt in a way that I appropriate because he was not thinking so much in terms of politics, more specific. Partly, but not, it was not essential for him. And that's why it could be kind of fun or whatever in a different way. But I think the difference that I would see today between Frankfurt's argument and mine, I mean, if I could put it this way, is that for him, it was just sort of disregarding truth. In my perspective, it's attacking the very idea of truth and all the regimes of truth that are supposed to convey a certain vision of truth. So I'm not saying the truth, but different regimes of truth. Attacks against the judiciary system, attacks against the media, attacks against the publishing industry, attacks against academia. They're all part of the same logic. And again, the point that I think is relatively specific to academia is the fact that there's a circulation with the younger generations. So in a way, it's the idea of controlling the future and not just the present.
Quick question, very simple. So what's the end goal of that, all these attacks? Because right now, I feel the power is already on the other side, so to speak, right? They have the money, the attack are being quite successful. So according to you, what's the end goal? Quelle est la fin de l'histoire?
Well, I can say what the implicit or explicit, it doesn't really matter, intention is, the goal. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen, but I think the goal is if you destroy all the regimes of truth, you're left just with one regime of truth, which is that of power. It's not exactly surprising that the network that was created by Donald Trump is called Truth Social. And the very idea that truth is social, which means it's just opinions, is, I think, quite significant. So if you have a monopoly on the definition of truth, which is not the case usually, that is where you have different regimes of truth, if you have a monopoly, that's considerable power. For example, if you can decide that state statistics are not true. I mean, leave alone gender, race, and all that, but just state statistics, or medical results, or whatever, or climate science, etc. Basically, it means that truth is embodied by the king.
But everybody is profiting from that truth. The king would have the power, but what about the other people participating in that truth?
I think, if I heard correctly, you say who's profiting from that, right? The king, but also the people who support the king. That is basically the close circle around the king. And I don't want to focus only on the US. There was an article today in Le Monde about results by INSEE about the huge gap of fortune in France, a rate of 1 to 167, which is getting wider all the time. And when we know that at the same time we have a discussion and many people opposing, many people in power saying, no, we should not have a tax on the 18,000 people in France, on the 1,800 people in France who have more than $100 million. I would say that gives an idea of who's profiting.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask you if you think that the ties between masculinity and anti-intellectualism get played out differently in France and the United States, and if so, how, in terms of the guys and the bro culture that you were talking about?
Well, the first thing is that in the US, and not just in the US, I think also I've seen in Brazil or in Argentina, the masculinist discourse is in politics is very explicit. I'll take an example from Bolsonaro, who, when running for re-election, on the national holiday, he gave a speech with his smiling, beautiful wife next to him, using repeatedly and getting the crowd to repeat the word imbrosabveu, which means, and I don't quite know how to translate it, but basically it's about the idea that I'm trying to find a polite way to put it, that it's a sort of endless erection that is on the national holiday. When you see also, I mentioned before, Mark Zuckerberg and the idea of MMA, which has, I mean, I didn't know the word MMA until a few years ago. I've been catching up with my American culture. It's difficult to keep up. But you may remember the challenge between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. And you may or may not remember the end of this. That is, Mark Zuckerberg decided not to, but Elon Musk said, well, we could have a penis size contest. That was on Twitter. That is a relatively radical form. I don't think we've had that yet in France. We're working on it. But I think the masculinism of all this is very important. In a way, the sort of the rise of a right-wing culture that combines people like, what's his name, the guy who died recently, Hulk Hogan, is that right? And incels. So you have the two together, the two sides. That is, on the one hand, the very muscular masculinity, on the other, the sort of poor guy who's out of the heterosexual game and who's a loser in the heterosexual game. They're on the same side. So the two faces of this sort of hegemonic masculinity. So I think that's a general evolution. I don't think that it has played such a role in France, although Éric Zemmour has tried to embody that. Before he was known so much for his racist stuff, including anti-Semitic stuff, but he was also against in defense of le premier sexe, against Simone de Beauvoir's deuxième sexe. So, and of course, physically he looks less than like Hulk Hogan, but more than like an incel. But it's something that has been theorized, by Michel Houellebecq. Michel Houellebecq in the 1990s wrote his book on l'extension du domaine de la lutte. And it's a book where he explains that there's this sexual competition with the losers and the winners and all that. Of course, then there was this happy moment when he discovered that you could resort to international prostitution in Asia, which gives you a second chance if you don't qualify in the first round. But I think it's very much present, and Houellebecq, of course, is not just a literary figure, but also a political one. So I think the degree of development of this rhetoric is not the same in France and the US, but I do believe that the same logic is at work. It seems to me.
Yeah, so I was interested, you were talking about this phenomenon of the sort of anti-intellectual, which seems like a bit of an oxymoron. but what do you think the sort of place is for those people in terms of the actual political influence that they can exert? Because sort of mocking other intellectuals is one thing, but do these people who often write, you know, opinion pieces about how gender theory is so awful, do they actually have a sort of real control or a degree of power in the sort of French government, for example?
Well, you know, there's a phrase that has been used very often against people like me, that we're idiot utile. And I always thought, at least if we're utile, that's something. But you know, basically the sort of I forget how it's called in English. It's the fools, the useful fools, I think. Useful idiots. Sorry, thank you. What is striking to me is what is the function of all these intellectuals developing anti-intellectual discourse? It's a way of saying, no, we're not attacking academia, we're just attacking bad academia, because other academics are saying this is very bad. So it's just a political function, and I think the term idiot utile would not be totally irrelevant. But it's not that they're naive, it's that basically they know what they're doing and they get benefits. That is, for example, when they organized a conference in the Sorbonne in 2022, I believe, you had the Minister of Education introducing this and using the funds of his ministry to do that. And then you had the special advisor of Emmanuel Macron concluding the conference and all that. I mean, that's not what you're going to get in most other circumstances, and perhaps that's not a bad thing.
Sir, you already have the mic, so.
Thank you. You spent a lot of time talking about academia. I wanted to press you on things that are taking place outside of academia, and which seem to be even more powerful things for policing minds and thoughts and discourse. One is Le Printemps Républicain, which is operating as a very powerful, if nebulous, organization to police the discourse around race, laïcité, and even anti-Semitism. And the other is the CRIF, which is kind of the French equivalent of APAC, I would put it that way. Could you say a word on these two organizations and how impactful they are? Because that seems to be feeding back into academia, but it seems to me that the origin of the policing of the minds and the discourse is not originating from academia and from academic fights.
Well, it has taken on a new, I mean, you're right about Printemps Républicain on the one hand and about CRIF on the other. CRIF was not specifically against academics. It's just the accusation of anti-Semitism, etc. Whereas Printemps Républicain, in many ways, was at least in part an academic effort with someone like Laurent Bouvet and others. Now, I think the Printemps Républicain played a major role in all these polemics against wokeness, against cancel culture and all that. It's not been so central, in part because the people have sort of scattered around. I mean, the Amin El-Khatmi is now close to the National Rally, etc. So why are they influential? Why was someone like Marlène Schiappa influential, who is the minister, part of that group or part of that mouvance? I think, they're influential because it's convenient justification for some of the attacks by the government. In particular, there's one element that I haven't developed yet or here, is that I've insisted on the sort of neo-fascist turn. But it's, as I said briefly, it's also a neoliberal logic. That is, the two converge. And that's why it's been so powerful. Because if it were just about ideology, it wouldn't work as well. But it's also against the fact that critical thinking, that's a waste of money. So on the one hand, you have neo-fascists who say that academia is dangerous. On the other hand, you have neoliberals who say it's a waste of time and money. At a time when they're developing private higher education in France, which is more or less controlled by the far right. So the convergence of the two, I think, is a key to, and I haven't developed that, but it's part of the grand scheme of things. About the CRIF has played a role as, in French, one would hesitate to say a lobby because there's an association of the word lobby with anti-Semitism. In the US, I think it's more commonly used, and it would be difficult to dispute that it has tried to play the role of a lobby, that is to lobby the government and exert pressure, etc. That's been important, but that's been important, for example, in attacking the left outside of academia, for example, or in particular attacking La France Insoumise and etc. Today, I think, sorry, the CRIF is the Representative Council of Jewish Institutions in France. And of course, as you know, when you say representative, usually it means you're not representative. I mean, because otherwise you wouldn't have to say it. That was the same for the CRAN, Conseil représentatif des associations noires. I mean, claiming to be representative is to say, I will speak in the name of everyone. It doesn't mean that one does. It just means that one would like others to believe it. And I have more sympathy for the CRAN than I did for the CRIF. But I think as far as these attacks are concerned today, the LICRA is more important. It's an association, a league, Oh, yeah, c'est quoi le I? La Ligue? I think it's international. It's not international, it's French. I forget, but it's against racism and anti-Semitism, but it has focused mainly on anti-Semitism, and the discussion about racism has been less important, except that they're the association that convinced judges to talk of anti-white racism. So because anti-racist associations had avoided going there, but the LICRA. C'est international? Oh dear. Thank you.
Does it mean you're really international?
So the LICRA, I think, plays a more specific role, which is to sort of, for example, the LICRA, as I said, I think briefly at the beginning, for the Collège de France Story was one of the instruments, and they spoke in the name of academic freedom, which is very bizarre, the fact that people who have nothing to do with academia could attack the Collège de France in the name of academic values. So, I mean, there are many actors. And for example, when there was an attack against a conference in 2017, a whole conference supported by many research centers on intersectionality that was almost canceled. The Printemps républicain was really playing an important part. It seems to me that it's less central as such today. But of course, I mean, it's a whole network. For example, you have people who've been very much involved in transphobic campaigns, and also people who've been really mobilized against écriture inclusive and against anti-Semitism and against wokeness and against etc. So it's a network that I think is very efficient at the moment, but in part because it serves the interest of an authoritarian neoliberal government.
Thank you. This is a really helpful and powerful synthesis. I'd like to, well, first of all, the point about the connection between the ideological attacks and the investors in private education. I mean, that holds very much here, as you know. It is, the architect of the compact is also the founder of the University of Phoenix. So, it's, it's not incidental. But I'd like to come back to the relationship between academic freedom and freedom of speech, because you're right that there is this combustible encounter between the free speech of students and the academic freedom of the universities and of faculty. And you're right to separate these two concepts. They need to be separated. But how do you approach the boundaries, these fuzzy areas, So when are you speaking, this is kind of the Kantian question, when are you speaking in your private capacity as a citizen, and when are you speaking as, as what? As an employee of an institution, as an intellectual, when we're talking about social media, when we're talking about if you attend a demonstration and you speak, I think we've all absorbed the message, only speak about what you know from your position of expertise in your classroom. Very often that becomes complicated, right? That it's not so easy to, how exactly we define that domain of specialization, that expertise. So I wonder where you would take those questions.
Obviously, it's complicated, and there's no clear-cut definition, etc. These are sort of ideal types, and hopefully useful as such. But I don't want to avoid the question. I think one element that in particular has been developed in the US in thinking about academic freedom is extramural freedom. That is, it's not just speaking about the research that you've done on this or that. So it's not extramural in the sense of extramuros outside the university, but it's beyond your specific expertise. And one example that I have taken, because I've written on this an article, but one example that I take is that of someone, a historian, now dead, Pierre Vidal-Naquet. Pierre Vidal-Naquet was very engagé intellectual. And I would differentiate, and maybe it's inaccurate, but just for the purposes of explanation, between two kinds of engagement on his part. That is, when he was fighting against Holocaust denial, on the one hand, and on the other, when he was fighting against the use of torture in Algeria. Again, it's just for the purpose of trying to clarify the notion. I haven't done the investigation to know exactly, etc. So I would say that his mobilization against torture in the Algerian war was as a citizen, not as a historian. It's debatable, but that's the example I want to take, that you can mobilize on certain things just as a citizen. And it's based on your values and etc. In the case of his fight against what is called the Holocaust deniers, but there's the phrase that he used, the Eichmann de papier, paper Eichmann. And what he was using then was his expertise as an historian, not an historian of World War II, because he was an historian of ancient Greece, but as a historian. And I think it's something that we have to claim. Of course, there's no clear-cut definition, but I think basically if it's just an opinion, it's a question of freedom of speech. If you try to build from your professional type of knowledge, whatever it is, it's different. For example, we had, there's a colleague, a sociologist who was, during the COVID-19 pandemic, who was making arguments that I think were just a matter of opinion, basically. He doesn't, I think, know more than I do on this. So I think in that case, I would say he's free to say it, but he cannot claim academic freedom. So of course, I mean, it's not a clear-cut opposition, but basically, thank you. I knew I was going to be a heavy drinker, but so I think it's important to think, I mean, in my own practice, I try. That's why, for example, I decided not to talk about certain, that's part of the reason why I decided not to talk about certain things, because I feel my social utility, if there's any, is to try and mobilize my professional experience, expertise, or whatever, and try to do something with it. In this context, I feel strongly that that's the best thing I can do. It doesn't mean that I cannot sign petitions where I just express my opinions, etc. But even when I do that, what I have tried to do in my work over the decades is that, for example, and there's a book of interviews that was just published, and I go back on this, and in the late 1990s, for political reasons, that is, believing in equality, I started speaking up on gay rights, to simplify things, on PACs, etc. I knew nothing about this, and so I decided that I should acquire some kind of expertise. And so I tried to learn about the sociology of the family and about the anthropology of kinship, etc. But also about the politics of all that, blah, blah, blah. So that's an example of a choice that I have made. I'm not saying everyone is doing the same thing or should, but is trying to think, if I want to do something that is useful, since I'm an academic, I might as well try to acquire the kind of academic expertise that will help me say things about what I want to talk about. Because otherwise, I feel that what I have to say is not worth saying. I'm not saying one shouldn't. And of course, I realize that academics who express on a tweet or whatever their opinions and all that are, but they are in trouble or can be in trouble. I think it's a question of freedom of expression. It's different from extramural. And that's why I drew this distinction between the two Vidal-Naquez.
To go back to push a little more on Madeleine's question and go back to the question of truth. Actually, I remember in the Pierre Vidal-Naquez memoirs, he says already when he is fighting against torture in Algeria, that he is using the methods of like the classicist and looking at all the data, the tag, the material, the police records, what is missing in all the documentations in order to identify. Right, to identify holes and to identify at the time, the meurtre of Maurice Audin and all that. So, I think just to like emphasize that it is complicated and that the competencies that you can, acquire and then mobilize in your professional regime of truth is actually what you can also mobilize outside of it. And so, whatever, it's a little pedantic to
I
go back
agree.
to.
I use that as an example, and I'm not saying that I haven't done my homework on this. That is, I haven't checked the history of all this. So I agree. I'm quite willing to concede that it doesn't.
Beyond the homework and the historicity of this, it's a larger issue of.
No, but I think you can also intervene. If I intervene on certain issues, say if I write an open letter to the president about this or that, or it's not necessarily that I have any kind of expertise or mobilizing any kind of expertise. And in that context, it's my freedom of speech. So I think it's, in any case, maybe Vidal-Naquez is not a good example, but I think in some cases, we just speak as citizens. That's, for example, in the debates about the PACs, I was very careful. I was criticizing colleagues who spoke in the name of anthropology or sociology or whatever to say it's not possible. And what I was saying is that I'm using my expertise or recent expertise or relative expertise in these fields to dispute the fact that you can do it in the name of science. So it's a complicated game, but I think that's what we have to think about. That is, when are we using some kind of professional expertise and how, etc. So it's not a solution to all this, but it's a way of exploring what we're doing and trying to think and to clarify what we're doing as we're doing it.
Thank you. Two more questions. One here.
I have a question. I would be happy if we can establish like a clear distinction between opinion and the pursuit of truth. I'm also not exactly 100% sure that there's that much difference between truth social, like looking at truth as social, and a truth regime in the Foucauldian sense. But in any case, I was wondering if we assume that there is such a boundary and we can defend sort of academic freedom presupposes that we have an academia, that we have an academy. And I'm sometimes a little bit dyslexic, so when I first saw your title, I read it as intellectual anti-statism, because I'm more familiar with the concept of anti-statism than with the concept of state used as an adjective to like qualify anti-intellectualism. And I think that's sort of a mirroring phenomenon. I think one of the reasons, I mean, the question in the back, what do we do now? I think we have also abandoned, or rather, we have actively fought against the institution, including academic institutions, for so long. The left has done that for so long that the right has understood, hey, you know, these institutions, including the state power, are very useful if we take them over to attack whatever is left of these institutions, whether it's judicial institutions, academic institutions, the one that you listed as sort of alternative truth regimes. So this is not exactly your topic, but I do think it matters that we have a phenomenon, including in France, all the authors of the French theory, which is then imported, are basically state employees. But they also have brought over to this side of the Atlantic an anti-statism, autonomism, you know, politique à distance de l'État, and so on, which includes something that is very often sort of easily imbibed, sort of, I am working in an institution, but I'm actually against the institution where I'm working at. And particularly at Columbia, that's very strong for obvious reasons these days. But there is this sort of conflation between, especially now that we have an agreement with the federal government, you can easily say, my institution is the same as the government, so I'm going to fight against both. But I'm still here in this institution. And we are not actually that different from the libertarians on the other side. So just like there is a left-wing McCarthyism, there's also a left-wing anti-institutionalism or libertarianism. And so what do you think about that tendency that we have, in a sense, not strengthened the institution of the academia that should protect the notion of academic freedom? We're not very well equipped to do that.
I think, well, on the first point, that is the difference between freedom, between opinion and truth, or whatever. To clarify, perhaps, the distinction and the way I use it, if you think of the judiciary system, in the US, it works with a regime of truth that is based on jurisprudence. Of course, we know that it depends on all that, but it's supposed to abide by certain rules, which are the rules of the profession. Of course, now we have doubts about what's happening. But precisely if we had doubts, it's because we sort of expected them to work that way. So it's in that sense, there are rules of the game in the different regimes of truth. For example, journalists, we used to expect that they would have certain criteria for working things out and sort of having two sources or whatever and stuff like that. These are professional norms, which is not the case for just opinions. So I think I don't want to say there's no relation between the two, because of course, the different regimes of truth also have to do with values. I mean, it's not, in sociology, I mean, people are fighting in part for political reasons within the discipline, but in terms of the discipline, up to a point. So, and about the second thing in the state, I think it's not untrue, but I think we tend to exaggerate because in fact, the main thing that defined people like Foucault, Bourdieu, etc., was critique, which is not the same thing as saying, let's get rid of the state, for example. And critique, I think, is fundamental because we should not abandon critique in the face of what is going on today. So that's the difference in a way between critique and criticism or whatever. I mean, it's not just denouncing, it's sort of invoking certain values. And I'm thinking of Jacques Derrida, who's part of that crew. He wrote L'Université sans condition. And his vision at the time, and I read it as I was working on academic freedom in the last couple of years, his vision of this university without conditions is that you can say everything. So he's not concerned about bullshit, as I am. And in particular, there's a good reason, which is picked up by Judith Butler versus Robert Post, is the idea that disciplines try to stifle heterodox positions, which is true. But that was his main concern. And why? Because he was saying, you know, we could feel some kind of nostalgia for the good old days of Kant, because Kant was persecuted by the King of Prussia. And so you had clear censorship. And now that's not how it works. Basically, he means it's my colleagues in philosophy who don't want to recognize what I'm doing. And so we had to create the Collège International de Philosophie to sort of open a space or whatever. And it's true, of course. But in a way, when you read Derrida today, you feel kind of nostalgic for the days of Derrida, because you feel, wow, those were great times when basically you didn't feel that it could come from the powers that be, but just from your colleagues. And of course, I don't want to minimize, because now we also have the colleagues. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily anti-state. After all, I mean, someone like Bourdieu was not anti-state, as we saw after 1995, because basically many people on the left realized that being anti-state could be instrumentalized to dismantle the welfare state in particular. And today, I think if we look at what's happening in the US or elsewhere, the sort of taking over the state is a way of dismantling the state. For example, the Department of Education. For example, the FBI, etc. So it's not such a clear-cut thing.
One last question. Hi, thank you. Your journey for us began in 1990, and throughout the journey, you've taken us to Florida, where there is the return to McCarthy. We have Tucker Carlson here returning us to Hitler, and I just saw in France there's a small little town that was celebrating Pétain. I'm wondering to what extent the work you're doing reflects upon sort of the ideological, historical repetition that we're seeing. How does it play out in terms of a strategy you see for engaging the current moment that we're in?
Since I work on actualité, as I said before, I tend not to think in terms of repetition. That's why, for example, I say neo-fascism and not fascism, because I think it is useful to think both that it has something to do with what happened in the past, but in a different context. Think, for example, of the way of invoking anti-Semitism. It has changed quite dramatically if you compare the 1930s and today. So theoretically now we have, well, things are not so clear with the MAGA people apparently, but now we're told that basically to be a good person in France, you shouldn't be anti-Semitic, and the left is anti-Semitic and the far right is not, which is not confirmed by the evidence that we have based on the yearly report by the Commission Nationale Consultative des Droits de l'Homme, which radically contradicts all that. But I won't get into that. So I think it's not so much repetition, but it's a sort of recycling. Basically, politics is always about recycling. I mean, you take sort of, for example, anti-Americanism can serve this purpose or that purpose at different times. And so it will be used on one side or the other. Same with anti-statism, same with everything. I think basically you have a sort of repertory of instruments, of conceptual tools, of images and all that, that keep being recycled. So then, of course, what is interesting is that it's not just recycled, it's also clearly invoking this memory. So, but it doesn't mean that it's just the repetition. For example, today the far right is very much in favor of de Gaulle. You can't trust anyone anymore. I mean, and that I think is important, because basically we should not take this literally. These are appropriations all the time. So basically saying Pétain is a great guy, of course it's a way of playing on all that, and then the question will be, but was he protecting Jews or was he endangering Jews? That's the next question. But for the moment, as colleague Jean-François Bayard wrote in a piece a few days ago, isn't it strange that you can ban or cancel a conference in the Collège de France and it's confirmed by a judge. And at the same time, the demonstration that took place, the mayor said, no, it's going to take place. It's not going to take place. And the judge decided, yes, it can. So, I mean, it's interesting to put the different pieces together and to see how things keep being used and changed and etc. So we should not assume that something means the same thing all the time. That's why I believe that working with the concept of actuality is useful. For example, as everyone knows, the term republic can mean very different things. The term laïcité keeps, I mean, it has changed meanings in a radical way. That is, basically, it's the opposite of what historical laïcité was supposed to be about. So the terms can be appropriated, but of course they're resignified, and sometimes resignified, almost designified. That's a neologism.
Thank you. We're going to stop here. I'm very aware that I am limiting the freedom of speech of some people here who still have questions.
Not to mention my
but
academic freedom.
that it is in favor of, in honor of academic freedom, if I may. Thank you very much, Eric. And actually, I want to thank the Maison Française and its staff.
Me too.
And the associate director, Fanny Gay, and the director, Shani Pierre, because we don't have that many discussions at Columbia about central concepts of our professional life, such as academic freedoms. It's one of the few deep discussions we've had about this topic in the past 2 years, at least the one that I have heard. I may have missed some, but thank you for making this possible. Thank you. And thank you, Eric.